Hello. This week we are going to review Chapter 8 in our textbook on psychosocial development in early childhood. The objectives are to describe play in early childhood, discuss emotional and personality development in early childhood, discuss gender development in early childhood, explain how parenting practices influence development, and evaluate young children's relationships with siblings and peers. A child moves from seeing themselves as one-dimensional. The child climbs over or swims well, rather than seeing themselves as being a good athlete. They do not understand how you can have two conflicting emotions at the same time. By 5 to 6 years old, they can make connections between skills such as running or climbing high and one day being on a sports team. By the time the child is 7, he or she will move to generalized traits such as popularity or intelligence. Sadly, we carry this piece with us most of our lives. The developing self has several concepts that you need to understand. The self-concept is our total picture of our abilities and traits. The sense of self is a descriptive and evaluative picture of one's abilities and traits. At age 4, the child has single representations that are individual, unconnected characteristics, and all or none terms. Descriptions are one-dimensional and they are very concrete at this age. The child cannot distinguish between the real self, which is the person she or he actually is, and the ideal self, which is the person he or she strives to be. How do others see you? As a child, we start to recognize how others see us, and we incorporate that into our self-image. By 5 to 6, children can make connections between skills, as we said, like running fast or jumping high, and one day being part of a team. This is not always the case for them. A 3-year-old may know, I run fast, probably because they've been told they run fast. But they don't associate that to one day running track. About 5 or 6 years old, the child moves from making logical connections between one aspect of herself and another, but still in an all or none terms. And then in middle childhood, the self becomes multidimensional and it becomes more balanced and realistic. The child will move from generalized traits such as popularity or intelligence. There are, of course, racial and cultural influences on self-definition. Parents play an important role in shaping how a child understands race. Parents focus on affirming content. They talk about cultural traditions and important historical figures. They may discuss ethnic food and why it's important to take pride in your heritage. As children get older, then parents may include discussions of racial bias. But culture is really important to self-understanding. Think about your own culture. What did your parents teach you when you were children about your culture? Did they ever discuss your traditions or historic figures or even ethnic food? European Americans tend to be focused on individuality, whereas Indian and Chinese Americans see individuals as interrelated. Differences in self-concept can be seen in children's drawings. We know children absorb self-definitions as early as 3 or 4 years old. And we know that American children are more likely to focus on individual characteristics and in positive terms. Chinese children, for example, are more likely to describe themselves in terms of relationships with others and think of themselves as neutral or negative. It is a cultural focus on autonomy and individualism that impacts how we draw ourselves in pictures as children. If you see yourself as interrelated, you are more likely to draw yourself as being part of a family or smaller. If you are more interested in autonomy and individualism, as many Americans are, you're more likely to see children draw themselves as big in the pictures. Self-esteem is how we judge ourselves. How did you judge yourself? Do you judge yourself differently after you take an exam? If you do well or you don't do well? Did you say, I do great, or I need to do better, or what a crappy teacher? All of these answers tell you something about yourself. As children, our self-esteem seems to be unidimensional, and we see ourselves as all good or all bad. Self-esteem refers to the self-evaluative part of our self-concept. It is the judgment children make about their overall worth. Self-esteem in young children tends to be stable and not firmly based in reality, and unidimensional. Self-esteem refers to self-evaluations based on success. A failure is viewed as an indictment of worth and can lead to learned helplessness. For example, a child with contingent self-esteem will give up on a difficult task, assuming he or she will fail. Children with more non-contingent self-esteem tend to attribute failure or disappointment to factors outside themselves or the need to try harder. Children with non-contingent self-esteem attribute failure to factors outside themselves or the need to try harder, preserve and enjoy challenges, persevere and enjoy challenges, tend to have parents who praise efforts and not inherent abilities. These children tend to have a growth mindset and think that they can get better. How do you think this would carry with you into adulthood? I assure you that some of these skills and some of these ways of addressing your self-esteem in childhood, they do carry on. How many of you, when you were little, were hoping for a new toy and instead you got an ugly sweater from grandma? Children in this age group aren't good at hiding their emotions. The ability to understand and control one's feelings is a key advance of early childhood. Emotional self-regulation helps children to guide their behavior and to get along with others. Young children do not understand experiencing different emotions at the same time. To them, how could you possibly be happy and sad at the same time? The ability slowly develops, and most children do understand conflicting or ambivalent emotions by the time they're about 8 to 11 years old. What do you think the ability to regulate emotions tells us? Well, children who at 2 to 4 years old can't delay gratification are more likely to have behavior problems when they're 5 to 8 years old. It is important to remember that our culture impacts how we view self-esteem. but our self-esteem doesn't necessarily impact our outcomes. Let's try a review question. The first stage in development of self-definition, in which children describe themselves in terms of individual, unconnected characteristics, does what? One answer would be that it fails to separate the real from the ideal self. It is important for children to be able to regulate their emotions. When children are 3 to 4 years old, if they can't recognize their emotions and delay gratification, then they are less likely to be able to self-regulate at age 8 and may have behavior problems. The ability to self-regulate is key to advancing in early childhood. This would also apply to things like academic problems. Who do you think does better in school? The child that can slow down and self-regulate, or the one that displays no self-control? Let's think about emotions directed toward the self. Emotions directed toward the self, such as guilt, shame, and pride, develop by the 4th year. However, a few more years are needed to recognize these emotions and understand what brings them on. By about age 4 to 5, most children recognize facial expressions. By about 7 years of age, children start to understand that mental states can drive emotions. By 9, they start to understand more complex aspects of emotions. Let's think a little bit about emotions directed towards self. Guilt, shame, and pride develop near the end of the 3rd year, when children are self-aware and accept their parents' standards. By 4 to 5 years old, they recognize facial expressions of joy, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and distrust. And they talk about their feelings. 7-year-olds understand that mental states can drive emotions. You can feel one way and look another. By 9 years old, they start to understand more complex aspects of emotion. Situations can be viewed from multiple perspectives, and people can have conflicting emotions, happy and sad, at the same time. The need to deal with conflicting feelings is what Erikson believed this stage of psychosocial development was about. The stage of initiative versus self-doubt, initiative versus guilt, is the 3rd stage of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. This stage occurs during the preschool years, between the ages of 3 and 5. During the initiative versus guilt stage, children begin to assert their power and control over the world through directing play and other social interaction. Children who regulate the conflicting drives develop the virtue of purpose. Let's try another review question. Children whose self-esteem is contingent on success are most likely to? What might an answer be? They view criticism as an indictment of their own worth. So let's say that again. Children whose self-esteem is contingent on success are most likely to view criticism as an indictment of their self-worth. Let's spend some more time discussing gender differences in children while recognizing that some of the study in this area is controversial. I would recommend stopping here and reviewing milestone number 59 and then coming back to the presentation. Gender identity, awareness of one's femaleness or maleness, and all that that implies in one's society is an important aspect of the developing self-concept. Gender differences are psychological and behavioral differences between males and females. How different are young boys and girls, and why? Before age 3, they are more alike than they are different. We ask ourselves, how do children develop gender identity, and how does it affect them? Gender differences have long been recognized, and the question is, how much of this is true gender differences and how much is imposed by our expectations as adults onto children? Gender differences are psychological and behavior differences between males and females. Measurable differences between boys and girls before the age of 3 are very few. They are more alike than they are different. Boys have a higher activity level, superior motor performance, and a propensity for physical aggression, especially after puberty. Boys and girls do equally well on basic mathematics skills, which is a common misperception, but there are differences starting in elementary school. Girls perform better on verbal fluency, mathematical computation, memory for locations of objects, and problems that require algebraic solutions or short answers. Boys do better in mental rotations, especially tasks that require three-dimensional objects and, when it is timed, mathematical word problems and memory for spatial configuration. Girls tend to start using language early and combine more words, and boys are more likely to stutter and have reading disabilities. Before we talk about perspectives on gender development, I would suggest you stop and review milestone number 59, and then we will look at table 8.1 in your textbook. Gender roles refer to the behaviors and attitudes that a culture considers appropriate for males and females. The process by which children acquire a gender role is called gender typing, and gender stereotypes are preconceived generalizations about male and female behavior, and I am sure you all know many of those. Let's review table 8.1, the 5 perspectives on gender development. The biological approach focuses on the key processes of genetic, neurological, and hormonal activity. The basic belief is that many behavioral differences between the sexes can be traced to biology. The evolutionary approach associated with Charles Darwin believed that there were natural and sexual selection and that these were key processes. The basic belief is that gender differences stem from evolutionary differences in reproduction and parenting behaviors for each sex. The psychoanalytic approach of Sigmund Freud has resolution of unconscious emotional conflict as the key process and believes that gender identity occurs when the child identifies with the same-sex parent. The cognitive approach, or cognitive-developmental theory, is associated with Lawrence Kohlberg. The key process is self-categorization. The basic belief is that once a child learns she is a girl or he is a boy, the child interprets and uses information about behavior by gender. Social learning approach, or social cognitive theory of Albert Bandura, has observation of models and reinforcement as a key process. The basic belief is that the child observes and imitates gender behavior and is reinforced for appropriate behavior and punished for inappropriate behavior. We're going to review some of these a little bit more. But before we do that, let's take a time for a short exercise, and then let's go into the perspectives presented in 8.1. In this short exercise, what I would like you to do is get together with a classmate for about 10 minutes. Once you are together, search your textbook or trusted resources and put together a list of gender differences in girls and boys. Talk to those you know in class and see how your lists were similar and different. Let's talk a little bit more about the biological approach. Many cultures have similar gender roles, suggesting an underlying biological influence. There are some sex differences in terms of brain volume and in gray matter versus white matter in the brain. For example, male brains are about 10% larger and have more white matter, which is where the axons for communication between neurons are. Female brains have a higher proportion of gray matter and greater cerebral blood flow. Gender reassignment surgery often fails, indicating gender identity is rooted in biological factors and is not easily changed. The recent issue of transgender children highlights that gender identity is influenced by biology, but that does not mean the environment is unimportant. Higher testosterone levels in the womb are associated with gender-typical male play. There are some studies on intersex children, which is when children are born with ambiguous genitalia. John Money recommended that children be assigned a gender as early as possible so that they could have the most normal life and functioning, and it should be based on the appearance of the genitalia. Newer studies found difficulties with this approach, and it is hard to predict the outcome of the sex assignment at birth. In one study, 14 children genetically born male without normal penises but with testes were surgically assigned female at 1 month. 8 declared as male, 5 as female but had difficulty fitting in with girls, and 2 boys whose parents had refused sexual reassignment remained male. This is an important takeaway here, is that it isn't enough to tell a child their gender. There is evidence that there is a biological influence in people who identify as transgender. In identical twins, when one is transgender, 40% of the time the other is. Yet this does not happen in non-identical twins. Estrogen has less influence on boys' gender type behavior. One of the conditions that you should know about is congenital adrenal hypoplasia. So in the womb, girls have higher levels of androgens, male sex hormones, when they have this condition. They then show preference for boys' toys, rough play, and male playmates, and they have strong spatial skills, which, as we stated earlier, is more common in boys. A little more about the evolutionary approach. This is the theory of sexual selection is Darwin's theory that gender roles developed in response to men's and women's different reproductive needs. Men seek many partners to ensure the survival of their genes. Women invest heavily in pregnancy, breastfeeding, and their children. Evolution pushes men and women in different directions, but the evolutionary theory also assumes people are sensitive to environmental inputs, like culture, that can minimize those sex differences. Darwin believed you could see the evolutionary push in the way children play. Girls play house and with baby dolls, and boys play at fighting. In the psychoanalytic approach, Freud saw the process as one of identification in which a child adopts characteristics, beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors of the parent of the same sex. He considered this an important part of personality development. Identification occurs when the child gives up on the wish to possess the parent of the same sex. Of the other sex, sorry. Most developmental psychologists today favor alternative explanations. We'll talk more about Freud throughout this semester, and you can make your own decisions. Kohlberg's cognitive development theory suggested that gender knowledge precedes gender behavior. I must know I'm a girl before I can know I like girl things. When boys and girls realize their gender, they then tend to adopt behaviors that are consistent with their perceptions. In a process of self-categorization, children actively extract knowledge about gender from their environment, and then they act consistently with that behavior. There are three cognitive theories. One is cognitive development theory, gender schema theory, and social learning theory. Kohlberg's cognitive development theory believed that the acquisition of gender roles hinges on three-stage process of gender constancy, which is a child's realization that his or her gender will always be the same. Gender identity is awareness of one's own gender, and that of others typically occurs between the ages of 2 and 3. Gender stability is the awareness that gender does not change. However, children at this stage base judgments about gender on superficial appearance. A lot of adults still do that today. Gender consistency is the realization that a girl remains a girl even if she plays with trucks, and a boy remains a boy even if he has long hair. This typically occurs between ages 3 and 7. Once children realize that change in outward appearance does not affect gender. There are some milestone presentations that you can look at that address this, and we'll show it to you. Another cognitive approach is Bim's gender schema theory. Gender schema theory proposes that children socialize themselves in their gender roles by developing a mentally organized network of information about what it means to be male or female in a particular culture. Bim suggested that children show stereotypical behavior as a result of gender conformity, but there is little evidence to support the hypothesis that gender schemas are at the root of stereotype behavior. There are some significant problems with this theory, such as there is little evidence that gender schemas are at the root of the stereotypical behavior, or that children who are highly gender typed necessarily feel pressure to conform. Also, gender typing does not always become strong with greater gender knowledge. The basic belief of social learning theory is that children model behaviors and adopt those behaviors based on rewards for doing so. How many of you have heard someone say, "act like a boy," or compliment girls on their pretty dresses? There is some research that calls this into doubt and suggests it takes more than modeling and compliments. According to Mischel, a traditional social learning theory predicts children imitate models and are rewarded for gender-appropriate behavior. The more contemporary social cognitive theory incorporates cognitive elements. Children learn gender roles through socialization. Children are not passive. They actively learn gender-type behaviors by selecting or creating their own environments through the choice of playmates and activities. Social influences do have an impact on gender development. there are three major social influences. They are family, peers, and culture. In the family, if it tends to reinforce traditional gender schemas, they are more likely to have strongly gender-typed children. Children who play in same-sex groups or by themselves tend to be more gender-typed. Boys tend to be more gender socialized than girls, and cultural transmission of gender roles occurs through television, children's books, and other forms of media. Let's talk about a little research. From an evolutionary perspective, play has a purpose. Evolutionary psychology assumes that play has several adaptive functions. First, exercise play develops muscle strength, endurance, efficiency, and coordination. Object play develops tools, use and learning, and what can be done with the tools. And social play is an opportunity to learn and practice societal norms. This is one way of saying that play isn't frivolous and it is time well spent. One of your most difficult tasks is to learn how to navigate the complex social world in which you live. And through play, we learn how to interact with others. Maybe we should play more often, even as adults. Let's stop and look at milestone 61 to see the types of play. And then let's come back. Let's discuss the categories of play. Play can be categorized by cognitive complexity and social dimensions. Functional play is the simplest form and begins in infancy. It involves repetitive muscular movements like rolling a ball. Cognitive or object play involves using objects or materials to make something, such as drawing pictures with crayons, hopefully on paper and not on the walls. Dramatic play is pretend play, and it involves imaginary people and situations, peaking in preschool and declining as school-age children engage in formal games with rules. Let's take a look at Table 8.2. Mildred Parton identified 6 types of play from the least to the most social. As children get older, the play becomes more interactive and cooperative. Table 6 explains these. There is unoccupied play, and this is when children does not seem to be playing but watches anything of interest. Onlooker behavior play is when children spend most of their time watching other children play. Solitary independent play is when the child plays along with toys that are different from those used by nearby children and makes no effort to get close to those other children. Parallel play is when the child plays alongside other children but not with the other children. The parallel player does not try to influence the other children's play. And then associative play. And in this, the child plays with other children. All the children play similarly, but there is no organization around a goal. Each child is interested more in being with the other children than actively themselves. It should be noted that Parton was wrong about non-social play being less mature than social play. Of course, this was done many, many years ago, and we have learned a lot since then. You've already read and no doubt know that girls are more likely to play with dolls and boys are more likely to play with trucks. We also know that adults tend to reprimand children for playing with the wrong toy. So when we talk about influences of play, of gender and culture, we know that part of this is directly influenced by the adults in their life. Gender segregation is the tendency to select playmates of one's own gender. When preschool girls and boys play together, they usually play with masculine toys such as cars and trains. In Western culture, we value independence and initiative. Collectivistic cultures emphasize self-control and group harmony. All of these things can influence the way in which children play. I'm going to shift tracks a little bit and talk about forms of discipline and parenting. Discipline refers to methods of modeling children's character, teaching them self-control, and engaging in appropriate behavior. All parents have some form of discipline. Reinforcement is viewed by a child as rewarding, and there are two types of reinforcement. External reinforcements are tangible. They're things like giving a child candy for good behavior, or intangible, for example, a hug. Eventually, they are internalized as a sense of accomplishment. Punishment, such as denial of privileges, can be effective. Punishment that is too harsh is counterproductive. The use of physical force or corporal punishment is usually considered counterproductive. Let's talk a little bit about strategies for discipline. Inductive techniques are designed to encourage desirable behavior and discourage undesirable behavior by appealing to a child's sense of reason and fairness. These are usually the most effective way to get children to accept the parent's standards. Power assertion discourages undesirable behavior through physical and verbal enforcement of parental control. I think you all have probably heard the voice that some parents use to control undesirable behavior of children. And finally, withdrawal of love involves ignoring, isolating, or showing dislike of a child. Baumrinn's parenting styles, and Baumrinn defined 3 styles of parenting, and later Jacoby and Martin added a 4th. But the 3 styles of parenting differ in terms of warmth and control. And she did this by doing a study where she looked at 103 preschool children in 95 families. And the 3 styles of parenting that were identified were authoritarian parenting, which emphasizes control and obedience with little warmth. Conversely, permissive parenting is warm and makes few demands and rarely involves punishing. Authoritative parenting is loving yet demands good behavior based on firm standards. And then the 4th style added later by Jacoby and Martin is neglectful parenting, which focuses on their needs and not on the child's needs. There are some critiques of Baumrinn's model, and of course these boil down to correlation is not causation, which leads to some of the criticism. The benefits of authoritative parenting are generally supported by research. Still, the model suggests there is one right way to raise children, reflecting a North American view. And among Asian Americans, obedience and strictness are not necessarily associated with harshness, but instead with caring and concern. Again, she showed a correlation with her study, but she did not show causation with her study. Some special behavioral concerns include promoting helping behavior, curbing aggression, and dealing with fears. Let's talk about helping. first. Altruism is a behavior intended to help others out of inner concern without an expectation of external rewards. In other words, you're doing something because you care about the other person, not because you are personally going to get anything out of it. Altruism is one type of pro-social behavior, which is any voluntary behavior intended to help others for a variety of reasons. Genetics, parental involvement, cultures with extended family groups, relationships with others, and popular media all influence the development of pro-social behavior. Altruism is the heart of pro-social behavior. Then there are multiple types of aggression. Instrumental aggression is used to reach a goal, such as hitting to obtain a desired toy, and this is kind of the most common type of aggression in early childhood. Every parent's nightmare when they're called from preschool to say your child's hitting another child or your child is biting another child. Yet this is very common in this age group. Overt aggression is openly directed at its target and employed more often by boys. And then relational or social or indirect aggression is used more often by girls and is subtle, damaging another person's relationships and reputations. And this carries with us as females into adulthood. Okay, there are influences on aggression. So why are some children more aggressive than others? There are a variety of reasons and factors that are involved. So one is temperament and genetics. Children that are intensely emotional or who have less self-control are more likely to be aggressive. Parental behaviors. How have the parents interacted? Stressful or unstimulating home environments can lead to more aggression. Witnessing violence is known to be associated with aggression. And then, of course, there are cultural differences in what is considered socially acceptable. And finally, let's talk a little bit about fearfulness. Passing fears are really common in early childhood. From 2 to 4 years old, they are often afraid of animals. And by the time they're 6 years old, they're more likely to be afraid of the dark. And other common fears include thunderstorms, doctors, and imaginary creatures, especially imaginary creatures that live under the bed in the dark. Fears dissipate as children better distinguish reality from fantasy. And of course, one of the things that we know is fears stem largely from intense fantasy life and the tendency to confuse fantasy and reality. So young children before 6 really aren't good at not realizing their imaginary friend is not real. And they're not good at realizing that their fears, the monster under the bed, is also not real. Sibling relationships are an important part of this age. They are the earliest and most frequent disputes are with siblings over property rights and access to parents. I don't think I had any more disputes with any of my friends than I had with my brother. Sibling disputes and settlements are socialization opportunities. Children stand up for their principles and they negotiate disagreements. This is good practice for adulthood. Sibling rivalry is not the main pattern of behavior. Actually, siblings are more likely to be affectionate and interested in what the other person's doing. They like the companionship, and the influences are prevalent in sibling relationships. Pro-social and play-oriented behaviors are a lot more common than the rivalry is. Usually siblings, especially siblings close in age, are your first best friend. And you tend to remain lifelong close friends with that sibling. Now, it's a little different for only children. In the United States, approximately 18% of children under the age of 18 are only children. Research shows that onlys are not selfish, lonely, or spoiled. They perform slightly better than children with siblings at school and work. Perhaps this is due to parents giving more attention to and expecting more from older children. But of course, playmates and friends are important. At about 3, children begin to have friends, and friends tend to be the same sex and age. Preschoolers prefer friends that do things together, like and care for each other, and share and help each other. Let's take a little look at the window on the world. There are cultural variations in age segregation. Older siblings exhibit teaching behavior, and younger siblings learn by observation and direct assistance. Younger and older children both benefit from age mixing. And we know that academic achievement in mixed grade classrooms is the same as or slightly better than same grade classrooms. Mixed age children are self-directed and more cooperative than children in same age classrooms. And yet we rarely see this in the United States. Well, this was a quick review of Chapter 8 in your textbook, and there is a lot more for you to read and to learn in the milestone activities. If you're in my course, please feel free to join me for office hours. You know how to contact me, and you know the link to those office hours, or you know I'm always in my office on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Feel free to stop by or send me an email. I'm always here to help you succeed.